welcome to our Sunday message. This morning on a church Zoom meeting, I shared a few ad-lib thoughts from the book of Habakkuk. I've been studying Habakkuk the last couple of days and I thoroughly enjoyed the message that the prophet brings. I think it's also a timely message to encourage the saints of God to stand fast and to have faith even in difficult days and difficult times. And so I thought I'd share a Bible study really this Sunday, and probably in two parts, knowing the length of the book, but to encourage us in the Word of God. I do thank the Lord for His Word, that it is powerful, that it is sharp than a two-edged sword, that it is food for our souls and light for our steps. And it's very powerful that what He speaks through His prophets. And even though some of these books are thousands of years old, this was probably written about 600 BC. They're still relevant for today because mankind hasn't really changed and God's nature hasn't changed, and the needs we face are still the same. Thank God He's still committed indeed to building His church and to saving precious souls. So let's look at the book of Habakkuk, one of the shorter books in the Old Testament, only 3 chapters, but very powerful nevertheless. And being as it's so small, sometimes a bit difficult to actually find and to move around the minor prophets when you're not looking. But although it's short, this is such a key book because it contains a dialogue between the prayerful prophet and also the Lord his God. Habakkuk sees his role indeed not only as a voice for the Lord to the people, but he sees himself as a watchman, someone who's standing on a watchtower, someone who's looking after the spiritual life and of society around him, someone who prays for, intercedes for the people he's amongst, someone who has their best interests at heart, and someone who cries out to God to make a difference. And this is where indeed the book starts, because the prophet Habakkuk has a complaint, there's a problem in society which he has been reporting to the Lord, but it appears that God isn't listening. And so it deals with some of the ancient themes that many of us feel at times. Lord, where are you? What are you doing? Why aren't you listening? Why aren't you answering prayers? And indeed, I suppose for all of us, therefore, this book has something to say for various seasons in our life. Habakkuk the prophet starts this dialogue actually with allegations against God. So it wasn't God who initiated this as he does in many of the prophets, but Habakkuk initiated. And he actually accuses God of neglecting his people and of failing to ensure justice in society. This allegation receives an answer, but actually the answer itself stirs up more questions and even more allegation in the mind of the prophet. So finally, Habakkuk receives a revelation that overwhelms him and causes him to realize a number of things. Firstly, he realizes that things are more complicated than they might first appear. Secondly, that God's in control. Thirdly, that justice will prevail in the end. And fourthly, that God's ways are far higher than our ways. So as I mentioned, the book starts with Habakkuk the prophet coming to God with a troubled and overwhelmed heart. He has a complaint, but it ends with the same prophet actually being overawed by God and singing out in worship, a transformation that had happened within the mind and heart of the man. Habakkuk's experience should encourage all believers to actually honestly pour out their heart before the Lord. If we are too polite to discuss with God our concerns and our complaints, then we may never be able to move past them. They end up being bottled up inside. The book actually gives no indication of the time span between the various interactions between Habakkuk and the Lord. So we don't know how long it took. It could have been months, it could even have been years. But you can read it, the 3 chapters, in a matter of minutes. But I suspect it took a much longer period for actually Habakkuk to learn these lessons. The man would have to persevere and wait upon God in between these various dialogues. Now, what about the man himself, Habakkuk? Well, not much is known about him, apart from what we can glean from this very short book. Some commentators, based really on what Luther taught many years ago, suggest that the name Habakkuk means to wrestle or to embrace, but more modern commentators and translators actually state that they can't find any meaning from this Hebrew name. Habakkuk was a Jew, and he was writing about and amongst the kingdom of Judah. We can assume this because he makes no mention of the Chaldeans. Sorry, he only makes mention of the Chaldeans and doesn't make mention of the Assyrians, who were the nation that persecuted northern Israel. There's no doubt that Habakkuk was an accomplished writer who was very familiar with Psalms in Scripture. This is a beautifully written book and uses Hebrew poetic techniques such as parallelism and chiasm to actually produce a very beautiful bit of prose. The style of Habakkuk differs from other Hebrew writing prophets because he indeed starts the dialogue with intercession and laments, and rather than it being produced from the Lord with prophetic revelation. I'm going to stop that and start that again. The style of Habakkuk differs from other Hebrew writing prophets. Habakkuk's intercession and laments initiate the dialogue that produces the prophetic revelation. For other prophets, the word of the Lord initially came to them and commanded them to go and speak. Habakkuk was also a skilled musician. Some of the sections of the book are written as hymns or psalms, and he's the only author outside of Psalms that uses certain technical phrases, which we'll come across a bit later on. It is possible, but not proven, that Habakkuk was a Levite or a temple musician. He may even have been a priest. He certainly had access to the chief musician within the temple worship. So what about the date? The Lord declares that he's sending the Chaldeans, also known as the Babylonians, and remarks that this might seem a most unexpected event, so that we should put the date of the oracle prior to the rise of the Babylonian Empire and their defeat of Nineveh in 612 BC. There is a very notable and powerful verse in Habakkuk for which it's most famous. That's verse 4 of chapter 2. And it says, "Behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith." And that last part, of course, is well known among New Testament scholars. The just shall live by his faith. As we look at the themes of this book, we could conclude by saying that they are indeed justice and faith. The just shall live by faith. The prophet cried out for justice and receives a revelation that ultimately, and in God's good time, justice shall be done. Until then, the saints of God are called to walk in faith, trusting in the Lord, even though they go through the most difficult of seasons. The second half of this verse, chapter 2, verse 4, is quoted 3 times in the New Testament. Interestingly, each time it's quoted, the emphasis is on a different aspect of this short statement. In Romans 1, Paul quotes Habakkuk, and I'll read Romans 1, verses 16 to 17. Paul says, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith." So here Paul's emphasizing faith. He's speaking about faith, and he has to strengthen his argument, and he actually quotes Habakkuk saying, "The just shall live by faith." God, through the Bible, is calling each and every person to live by faith in him. In 1515, Martin Luther received the gift of salvation when Paul's words in Romans dawned on his soul, and the just shall live by faith. He wrote of that, he says, "At last, meditating day and night, by the mercy of God, I began to understand that the righteousness of God is that through which the righteous live by a gift of God, namely by faith. Here I felt as if I were entirely born again and had entered paradise itself through the gates that had been flung open." Beautiful words. Luther had come to understand the key doctrine of justification through faith, and it was the start of the Reformation in the church in Western Europe. Paul again quotes Habakkuk, chapter 2, verse 4, but this time in the book of Galatians. And in Galatians chapter 3, verses 10 to 12, he writes, "For as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone who does not continue in all the things which are written in the book of the law to do them. But that no one is justified by the law in the sight of God is evident, for the just shall live by faith. Yet the law is not of faith, but that the man who does them shall live by them. Here Paul's emphasis is on justification. Justification is a legal term. It means a person standing before the throne of God and being pronounced acceptable in the sight of God. The third quotation of Habakkuk 2:4 is in the book of Hebrews chapter 10. I'm reading verses 35 to 39. Therefore do not cast away your confidence, which has great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. For yet a little while, and he who is coming will come and will not tarry. Now the just shall live by faith. But if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not those who draw back to perdition, but are of those who believing to the saving of the soul. So here, the author of Hebrews, his emphasis from this verse, Habakkuk 2 verse 4, is upon life. Experience a fruitful, blessed and rewarding life that depends upon walking with God in righteousness and holiness. It requires this life that we walk and engage in the work of the kingdom, that we are kingdom-centered, kingdom-purposed people. So that's a bit of an introduction. Let's look at chapter 1 of Habakkuk. Verse 1 says, the burden which the prophet Habakkuk saw. So this, in a sense, appears to be a description of the whole book rather than just the first chapter. And it is probably a title for the book. The Hebrew word translated here as burden is massa, and its exact meaning is obscure, but is often been translated as burden or oracle. It is a term often used by the Old Testament writing prophets to mean a prophetic message that pronounce the God's judgment. But now we get into the chapter properly, verses 2 to 4. Habakkuk says, O Lord, how long shall I cry and you not hear? Even cry out to you violence and you not save? Why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are before me. There is strife and contention arises. Therefore the law is powerless and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore perverse judgment proceeds. Dark days for Judah, as Habakkuk indeed describes. His complaint is written in the form of a lament, just like those found in the book of Psalms. Through their laments, authors would ask questions of God, and Habakkuk asked typical questions. He asked, how long, O Lord, and why? As a prophet and watchman, Habakkuk raised the alarm and cried out to the Lord, violence, violence. He uses that word 6 times within the 3 short chapters of this book. It's only actually quoted, the word violence, that is, more times in the book of Proverbs and Psalms, both of which, of course, much longer books. Habakkuk accuses God of failing to hear and answer the prophet's prayers. He's observing sin, social disorder and injustice in Judah. And so he's lifted up his voice, he's seeking God's intervention. But the Lord hasn't answered and the problems continue. Instead of being a godly nation that exemplifies living by God's law, what was happening in Judah was that the powerful and the rulers were exploiting their countrymen. Later learned that the people were also engaging in the worship of idols and foreign gods. The authors of the Bible's wisdom literature describe the wicked as being those who don't believe that God observes the actions of men or that he doesn't intervene on behalf of the weak. The wicked therefore reject the fear of the Lord and exploit their neighbours. Habakkuk, of course, believes that the Lord does see what's going on and that he isn't indifferent to the cries of the poor. But his observations of life don't match his theology. This is therefore a trial of his faith. The problems in Judah went a lot deeper than the prophet realised. It wasn't just a case of a few individuals who needed to be stopped or punished. The whole nation had forsaken the law and the rot had gone to the core. Let's move on to the Lord's reply, reading from verse 5. The Lord now says to Habakkuk, look among the nations and watch. be utterly astounded. For I will work a work in your days which you would not believe though it were told you. So the prophet does receive an answer, but he's warned that it's something that he's not going to expect or even like. He should expect to be astounded by what the Lord is going to do and how he's going to deal with the problem. The history books and the prophets of the Old Testament describe how towards the end of Judah's monarchy, the Lord delivered his people into the hands of their enemies because of their continual and willful sin. And the revelation that Habakkuk is going to receive foretells this. Verses 6 to 10. For indeed I am raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation that marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves. Their horses are also swifter than leopards and more fierce than evening wolves. Their chargers charge ahead. Their cavalry comes from afar. They fly as the eagle that hastens to eat. They are all come for violence. Their faces are set like the east wind. They gather captives like sand. They scoff at kings, and princes are scorned by them. They deride every stronghold, for they heap up earthen mounds and seize it. So in response to the problem that the prophet has described, the Lord is going to raise up a foreign power who will invade the Holy Land. The Lord describes the Chaldean invaders as being terrible, dreadful and fierce. Their military abilities are described with comparisons to leopards and wolves and eagles, and an unrelenting hot desert wind. No king, no prince, and no stronghold can resist their advance. So Habakkuk's initial understanding of the problem was that it was a national issue of justice, but now God is describing the invasion of the region by a cruel foreign power. The solution seems worse than the problem. Erding from the Expositor's Bible commentary, I quote him when he writes, "If God's people refuse to hear him, they will ultimately be compelled to hear those less worthy of fear." So Judah was indeed failing to walk in the fear of the Lord, failing to respond to the word of God or the word through the prophets. Therefore, he would speak to them through a different voice, someone less worthy of fear, but someone indeed they can't ignore, and that will be the Babylonian invaders. Erding also notes, says, the Israelites' rejection of God's authority, mediated through the law, merely exposed them to the harsher experience of his authority, mediated through an alien people. Man may determine his conduct, how he will encounter God's sovereignty, but he cannot escape it. I do like Erding's thoughts in that. God is in control. He's speaking to, he wants us to respond. If we don't listen and respond to when he speaks with a still small voice, then he may have to bellow at us. If we don't listen and respond to him when his hand is gently upon us, then nations may have to hear when God indeed sends troubles to grab their attention. For the Jews or the Babylonians to think that they can act independently of God and determine their own future is utterly folly. It is a folly and delusion that many nations share today. Let's move on. Habakkuk 1 verse 11. It's still writing of the Chaldean invader. It says, "Then his mind changes and he transgresses. He commits offence, ascribing his power to his God." So though it is an action of the sovereign Lord of heaven that causes the resurgence of this terrible power, the Babylonian king will sin against the Lord by ascribing his success to the Chaldean gods. And this verse indicates that ultimately the Chaldeans will have to face God's judgment. It doesn't go into detail yet, but we'll read more of that coming. The individual mentioned in these verses that these verses speak about is most likely Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. In 605 BC, the Babylonians conquered Judah and took captive the best of the land, including Daniel. As predicted by Jeremiah, the Babylonians did return and finally destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. That was in 586 BC. The majority of the Jews were taken captive and dispersed throughout foreign lands. Jeremiah revealed that captivity was to last for 70 days. So the sovereign King of heaven was Lord over all of these things that were going on. It was the Babylonian army's practice, whenever they conquered a nation, to destroy the nation's temples and to take the images of these foreign gods and the wealth back to the temple of their deity Marduk. The book of Daniel describes how the Lord of Israel rebuked and humbled proud King Nebuchadnezzar. That's a great story, which unfortunately we can't go into now. So let's move on and talk about Habakkuk's confusion. The answer Habakkuk has received had not satisfied him. He now has more questions. The description of God's response seems inconsistent with the prophet's understanding of the Lord's character. And so he writes in verse 12, "Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have appointed them for judgment. O Rock, you have marked them for correction. You are purer of eyes than to behold evil, and cannot look on wickedness." So now the prophet's approaching the Lord with respect and plaudits. He states that the everlasting God will surely ensure that Israel will not perish, even though they will be judged and corrected. Habakkuk also describes the purity and holiness of the Lord. He is holy and will never be comfortable with wickedness, and the Lord will never look on and accept wickedness. Having said that, he moves on. He says, "Why do you look on those who deal treacherously and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? Why do you make men like fishes of the sea, like creeping things that have no ruler over them? They gather up all of them with a hook and catch them in their net. They gather them in their dragnet. Therefore they rejoice and are glad. Therefore they sacrifice to the net and burn incense to the dragnet. Because of them their share is sumptuous and the food plentiful. Shall they therefore empty their net and continue to slay the nations without pity?" Now we get to Habakkuk's new complaint. It appears to the prophet that what the Lord doing is exactly that which the scripture always maintained he wouldn't. He's condoning wickedness. These are his thoughts, Habakkuk says. If God is so holy, so as to judge Judah's sin, how can he use the Chaldeans whose wickedness and idol worship runs much deeper? If God is to turn his eyes away from Judah's sin, how can he watch over the Chaldeans in this time? And thirdly, if the Lord allows the Chaldeans this great military success, then they will attribute their success to their idols. So these are Habakkuk's reasoning. He appears to be suggesting that the Lord's actions are unjust and that they will make matters worse. He asks the Lord why he has made people vulnerable, in particular the people of Judah, so that they can be hunted and exploited. That brings us to the end of chapter 1. We'll start chapter 2. First, Habakkuk prepares himself to meet with the Lord and receive an answer. So in verse 1 of chapter 2 he writes, "I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me and what I will answer when I'm corrected." So he's asked the question why, and now he waits God for a reply. He uses the symbolism of a watchman standing on the city's defences to describe his role, his ministry. And the same language is used elsewhere amongst the prophets to describe that the role of an intercessor and an Old Testament prophet. Habakkuk is expecting that God's answer will bring a word of correction to his own heart. He realizes that God is not going to change, but that he is going to have to change and change his mind. Erding again says something noteworthy. He says, "It is a wise man who takes his questions about God to God for the answers." So he applauds Habakkuk. Some people indeed have questions about God, about what he does and how he does it. And rather than asking God about it, they ask other people. But the author, indeed, and the true authority on this is God himself. Let's move on to the Lord's answer. verses 2 and 3. Then the Lord answered me and said, write the vision and make it plain on tablets, that he may run who reads it. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it will speak, it will not lie. Though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry. The Lord does come with an answer, but it's not only for Habakkuk, and it needs to be written down, this answer, so that messengers can be sent with the message to warn and prepare God's people. And the reason why we can probably read this book and it's available to us today is because it was written down at the Lord's instruction. This vision is certain and it will be fulfilled. However, it is for the future and it won't be fulfilled immediately. But when the time is right, it will be fulfilled swiftly.